The sound of the slap echoed across the military training compound like a gunshot. Captain Marcus Thornfield's hand had just struck Sergeant Isabella Chen across the face in front of 40 recruits. And what happened next would shake the very foundations of Fort Meridian Base. But this story isn't just about one moment of abuse. It's about what happens when courage meets cowardice, when justice faces power, and when the true meaning of honor is put to the ultimate test. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun blazed over the Nevada desert as the 3rd Infantry Division completed their final combat readiness assessment at Fort Meridian. The air was thick with dust and tension as recruits pushed through grueling obstacle courses, their boots pounding against the sun-baked earth. This wasn't just any training day, it was evaluation day, where careers could be made or broken with a single performance. Sergeant Isabella Chen wiped sweat from her brow as she watched her squad navigate the rope climbing section. At 26, she was one of the youngest female sergeants on base, having earned her stripes through sheer determination and an unwavering commitment to excellence. Her dark hair was pulled back in regulation style, and despite the blazing heat, her uniform remained crisp and professional. She commanded respect not through intimidation, but through competence, a quality that hadn't gone unnoticed by her superiors or her critics. "Move it, Rodriguez," Isabella called out to a struggling recruit. "Your enemy won't wait for you to catch your breath." Her voice carried across the training field with authority that came from 3 tours of duty and countless hours, proving herself in a male-dominated environment. Captain Marcus Thornfield observed from the shade of a tactical vehicle, his cold gray eyes tracking every movement on the field. At 42, Thornfield was old-school military, the kind of officer who believed women had no place in combat roles and made no secret of his opinion. His weathered face bore the permanent scowl of a man who felt the world was changing too fast for his liking, and his rigid posture spoke of someone who ruled through fear rather than respect. "Sergeant Chen," Thornfield's voice boomed across the compound, "your squad is behind schedule." Isabella glanced at her stopwatch. They were actually ahead of the projected timeline, but she knew better than to contradict Thornfield publicly. "Yes, sir. We'll pick up the pace. No excuses." Thornfield strode across the field, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust with each deliberate step. "In my day, we didn't coddle recruits. Maybe if you spent less time playing mother hen and more time being a soldier, your squad would perform better." The recruits slowed their pace, sensing the tension building between their sergeant and the captain. Isabella felt 40 pairs of eyes watching her, waiting to see how she would respond. She had faced this kind of challenge before officers who questioned her authority, her methods, her very right to wear the uniform. "Sir, with respect, my squad's performance metrics are consistently above base average," Isabella replied, her voice steady despite the anger building in her chest. "Our completion times, accuracy scores, and physical fitness rankings. Are you questioning my assessment, Sergeant?" Thornfield stepped closer, invading her personal space in a calculated move designed to intimidate. The smell of stale coffee and cigarettes wafted from him as he loomed over her 5'6" frame. "No, sir. I'm simply providing factual data." "Factual data?" Thornfield's laugh was harsh and mocking. "The only fact here is that you're soft. You treat these recruits like they're your children instead of soldiers. In combat, that softness will get people killed." Isabella's jaw tightened. She had been in actual combat twice. She had pulled wounded soldiers from burning vehicles and had earned a Bronze Star for valor under fire. But she knew that saying any of this would only escalate the situation further. "I train my soldiers to think as well as fight, sir," she said carefully. "Mental toughness and physical strength. Mental toughness? Thornfield's voice rose to a shout that carried across the entire training field. You wouldn't know mental toughness if it slapped you in the face. And then, without warning, it did. The crack of his palm against her cheek was sharp and sudden, sending Isabella stumbling backward. The 40 recruits froze in stunned silence. Training sergeants stopped their drills. Even the Nevada wind seemed to pause in shock at what had just occurred. Isabella's hand instinctively moved to her burning cheek, her dark eyes flashing with a mixture of pain, humiliation, and barely contained rage. But she didn't speak. She didn't strike back. She stood there, in front of 40 witnesses, absorbing the most public humiliation of her military career. That's what happens when you question a superior officer, Thornfield announced loudly, his voice carrying to every corner of the training ground. Now get your squad back to work before I write you up for insubordination. The silence that followed was deafening. Recruits exchanged glances, unsure whether to continue training or bear witness to what would happen next. Some looked away, unable to watch their respected sergeant being degraded. Others stared in disbelief, processing what they had just witnessed. That Isabella stood perfectly still, her training warring with her instincts. Every fiber of her being wanted to respond, to defend herself, to show these recruits that no one had the right to lay hands on another soldier. But she also knew that any reaction could end her career and potentially put her soldiers at risk. What none of them knew, including Captain Thornfield, was that this moment was being watched by more than just the recruits and training staff. And what would happen next would prove that sometimes the most powerful response to injustice isn't immediate retaliation, but the unwavering strength to stand your ground until the truth reveals itself. The desert heat continued to beat down on Fort Meridian. But something had shifted in the air, something that would change everything. Preparing and narrating. This story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Isabella's cheek burned with a pain that went far deeper than the physical sting of Thornfield's slap. She could feel the heat radiating from the red handprint forming on her face, but it was nothing compared to the fire of humiliation coursing through her veins. For a moment that felt like an eternity, she stood frozen in place, her carefully maintained composure threatening to crumble under the weight of 40 staring eyes. Her hand trembled slightly as she lowered it from her cheek, the subtle shake visible only to those closest to her. Private Martinez, one of her most dedicated recruits, took an unconscious step forward before catching himself, his face a mask of barely controlled anger at seeing his respected sergeant treated like this. The young soldier's fists clenched at his sides, his knuckles white with the effort of restraining himself. "Eyes on your own training," Isabella managed to call out, her voice catching slightly on the first word before she steadied it. But the damage was done. Everyone had heard that momentary crack, that glimpse of vulnerability from a woman who had always seemed unshakable. The sound cut through the desert air like a confession of mortality from someone they had viewed as invincible. Isabella blinked rapidly, fighting back tears that threatened to spill over. She had cried exactly twice since joining the military, once when her father died during her second deployment, and once when she lost 3 soldiers under her command to an IED explosion in Afghanistan. She refused to let Captain Thornfield become the third reason, but the tears weren't just from pain or anger. They were from the crushing realization of how powerless she was in this moment. All her achievements, all her medals, all the respect she had earned from her peers and subordinates, none of it mattered when faced with the arbitrary abuse of someone with higher rank. She was just another female soldier being put in her place, and everyone was watching it happen. Her breathing became shallow as the full weight of the situation settled on her shoulders. This wasn't just about her anymore. Every female soldier on the base would hear about this within hours. Every recruit watching would remember this moment when they became leaders themselves. She was supposed to be setting an example, showing these young soldiers what strength looked like. And instead she was standing here like a victim. The regulation military cap she wore suddenly felt too heavy on her head, as if the weight of her responsibility was physically manifesting. Her usually perfect posture sagged almost imperceptibly, the confident set of her shoulders dropping by mere degrees, but in the military, where bearing was everything, those small changes spoke volumes. Isabella's throat constricted as she tried to swallow her pride along with her anger. She had survived 3 combat deployments, had stared death in the face multiple times, had pulled wounded comrades from hostile territory under enemy fire. Yet here, on her own base, surrounded by her own people, she felt more vulnerable than she ever had in a war zone. The silence stretched on, broken only by the distant sound of helicopters conducting training exercises and the occasional scuff of a recruit's boot against the sand. But that silence wasn't empty. It was pregnant with tension, with unspoken words, with the collective held breath of everyone present. Captain Thornfield stood with his arms crossed, a satisfied smirk playing at the corners of his mouth as he watched Isabella struggle to maintain her composure. He seemed to be savoring every second of her distress, feeding off the power he held over her in this moment. His gray eyes glittered with a cruel satisfaction that made several of the watching recruits feel sick to their stomachs. "Well?" Thornfield's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "Are you going to stand there all day feeling sorry for yourself? Or are you going to do your job?" Isabella's jaw worked silently for a moment, the muscles in her face tightening as she fought for control. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried clearly in the desert stillness. What would you like me to do, sir?" The question came out broken, hesitant, so different from the confident commands she usually issued. It was the voice of someone whose spirit had been temporarily crushed, whose confidence had been shattered in front of the very people she was supposed to lead and inspire. Private Rodriguez, a 19-year-old recruit from Texas, felt his own eyes begin to water as he watched his sergeant, someone he had come to view as a role model and mentor, reduced to this state. Isabella had been the one to encourage him when he'd wanted to quit during his first week. She had stayed after hours to help him improve his marksmanship scores. She had written recommendation letters for soldiers seeking advancement and had personally mentored dozens of recruits who had gone on to successful military careers. She stood before them diminished, her authority stripped away by one moment of abuse from a superior officer. The red mark on her cheek was already beginning to darken, and Isabella unconsciously touched it again, wincing at the tenderness. "Get back to your training," she said to her squad. But the usual authority was gone from her voice. It sounded hollow, defeated. "Continue with the rope climbing exercise." But none of the recruits moved. They stood transfixed, witnessing something that went against everything they had been taught about honor, respect, and military values. This wasn't the strong, confident Sergeant Chen they knew and respected. This was a broken woman trying desperately to hold herself together in front of the soldiers who depended on her. Isabella closed her eyes for just a moment, gathering what remained of her strength. When she opened them again, there was still pain there, still humiliation, but also a flicker of something else, a determination not to let this moment define her. Even as she struggled to process what had just happened, what none of them knew was that this moment of vulnerability, this display of very human pain and resilience, would soon transform into something far more powerful than anyone could have imagined. The training ground that had been buzzing with activity just moments before now felt like a frozen tableau. 40 recruits stood scattered across the obstacle course, their exercises abandoned as they processed what they had just witnessed. But rather than rallying to their sergeant's defense or expressing outrage at the blatant abuse of power, an uncomfortable silence settled over Fort Meridian like a suffocating blanket. Private Johnson, a 22-year-old from Ohio, slowly turned back to the rope climbing station, his movements mechanical and detached. He grabbed the thick manila rope with hands that shook slightly, not from exertion but from the internal conflict tearing at his conscience. Johnson had grown up in a household where his father had taught him never to let anyone disrespect a woman. Yet here he was, following orders to continue training as if nothing had happened. "Keep moving, people," called out Staff Sergeant Williams from across the field, his voice deliberately loud and commanding. Williams was a 15-year veteran who had served 2 tours with Isabella in Afghanistan. He had seen her courage under fire, had watched her risk her own life to save wounded soldiers, and had personally recommended her for promotion. But now, faced with the political reality of military hierarchy, he found himself looking away from her humiliated form and focusing, instead, on maintaining order among the troops. Private Martinez felt bile rise in his throat as he forced himself to resume the obstacle course. His grandmother had raised him after his parents died, teaching him that real men protected those who couldn't protect themselves. Every instinct screamed at him to march over to Captain Thornfield and demand an apology, to stand up for the woman who had mentored him and believed in him when no one else would. Instead, he climbed the wooden wall with robotic precision, his knuckles bleeding from gripping the rough planks too tightly in his frustration. The other training sergeants scattered throughout the compound continued their duties with studied indifference. Sergeant First Class Thompson, who had been conducting weapons training 30 yards away, made a point of shouting louder instructions to his own squad, as if the increased volume could drown out the uncomfortable reality of what had just occurred. His own discomfort was evident in the rigid set of his shoulders and the way he avoided looking in Isabella's direction. Lieutenant Patricia Hayes, the only other female officer present on the training ground, felt her stomach clench as she watched the scene unfold. As a woman in the military, she understood the precarious position Isabella now found herself in. She also understood that any intervention on her part could be seen as insubordination and could jeopardize her own career. So she stood by her Humvee, clipboard in hand, marking attendance as if this were just another routine training day, even as her heart pounded with suppressed anger and solidarity. The maintenance crew that had been working on equipment near the perimeter of the training ground suddenly found urgent tasks that required their immediate attention. In the opposite direction, Corporal Davis, who had been Isabella's friend since their basic training days 8 years ago, busied himself with checking tire pressure on vehicles that had been serviced just hours before. His jaw was set so tightly that the muscles in his face ached, but he forced himself to look busy, to be invisible, to avoid drawing Thornfield's attention to himself. Even the civilian contractors who were installing new communication equipment on the base seemed to sense the tension and kept their heads down, their conversations dropping to whispers. They had no official obligation to intervene, but their silence felt just as complicit as that of the uniformed personnel. Captain Thornfield surveyed the scene with satisfaction, noting how quickly order had been restored and how effectively everyone had fallen back into line. This was exactly the response he had expected and hoped for. In his worldview, this moment served as a perfect teaching opportunity, not just for Isabella, but for everyone present. It demonstrated the clear chain of command and the consequences of stepping out of line. "That's more like it," Thornfield announced, his voice carrying across the training ground. "This is how a military base should operate. Everyone knows their place, everyone follows orders, and we don't waste time with unnecessary drama." Private Rodriguez's hands trembled as he attempted to navigate the balance beam portion of the obstacle course. His concentration was completely shattered, but he forced himself to continue, one foot carefully placed in front of the other, because stopping would mean acknowledging what he had just witnessed. His mind raced with thoughts of his sister, who was considering joining the military. Would this be her fate? Would she face the same humiliation and have no one willing to stand up for her? The base chaplain, Major Robert Phillips, had been walking between training areas when the incident occurred. He had a clear view of everything that transpired, yet he found himself paralyzed by the complex intersection of his spiritual calling to comfort the afflicted and his military obligation to respect the chain of command. He stood frozen near the base of a communications tower, his collar feeling suddenly tight around his neck as he wrestled with his conscience. Even the military police officers who were conducting their routine patrol of the base seemed to develop temporary blindness and deafness. Sergeant Mike Foster, a 10-year veteran of the MPs, had heard the sharp crack of the slap from 50 yards away and had looked up just in time to see Isabella stumble backward. But assault charges against a superior officer, based on the testimony of an enlisted man, would be career suicide. And Foster had a wife and 2 young children to think about. The base medical officer, Captain Susan Park, who had been reviewing training injury reports in her nearby office, heard the commotion and glanced out her window. She could see the red mark forming on Isabella's cheek even from her distance, and her medical training made her want to rush out and examine the injury. But she also knew that offering unsolicited medical attention to what was officially a disciplinary matter could be interpreted as undermining Thornfield's authority. As the minutes ticked by, the collective inaction became its own form of action. Each person who chose to look away, to remain silent, to continue with their duties as if nothing had happened, was casting a vote for the status quo. They were declaring through their silence that this behavior was acceptable, that Isabella's humiliation was the price of maintaining order, that some injustices were simply too inconvenient to address. The desert wind picked up slightly, carrying with it the scent of sage and dust, but also something else, the bitter taste of cowardice and complicity that would linger in the air long after the physical evidence of the assault had faded from Isabella's cheek. None of them could have predicted that their collective failure to act in this moment would soon be overshadowed by someone who understood that true courage sometimes means standing alone against the crowd. From the observation deck of the administrative building that overlooked the training compound, a group of figures watched the scene unfold with growing intensity. The building's second floor housed the offices of senior command staff, and its large windows provided an unobstructed view of the entire training area. What had started as a routine observation of daily exercises had transformed into something far more significant. Colonel Sarah Mitchell stood at the center window, her steel-gray hair pulled back in a regulation bun, her weathered hands gripping the windowsill with increasing tension. At 54, Mitchell had dedicated her entire adult life to the military, rising through the ranks at a time when female officers faced obstacles that would have broken lesser individuals. She had commanded troops in Iraq, had overseen humanitarian missions in Haiti, and had earned the respect of soldiers and officers alike through 3 decades of exemplary service. Beside her stood Lieutenant Colonel James Rivera, the base's executive officer, whose usually calm demeanor had given way to barely concealed agitation. Rivera was a 26-year veteran who had served under Mitchell on 2 previous assignments. He had developed an almost paternal relationship with many of the junior officers on the base, including Isabella, whom he had personally recommended for her current position after witnessing her leadership during a joint training exercise with Navy SEALs 6 months earlier. Major Angela Foster, the base's Judge Advocate General and Chief Legal Officer, stood to Mitchell's left, her sharp blue eyes tracking every movement below while her mind raced through the legal implications of what they were witnessing. Foster had prosecuted dozens of military justice cases and had seen her share of command failures, but rarely had she observed such a blatant violation of military standards happening in broad daylight. With so many witnesses, also present was Sergeant Major Robert Chen, no relation to Isabella despite the shared surname, served as Mitchell's senior enlisted advisor. Chen was a 30-year veteran whose opinion carried enormous weight throughout the base. His presence in this observation group was no accident. Mitchell valued his perspective on matters affecting enlisted personnel, and his view of the current situation would heavily influence any decisions she might make. The final member of this impromptu gathering was Captain Michael Torres, a military intelligence officer who had been briefing Colonel Mitchell on base security matters when the commotion below had drawn their attention to the window. Torres was known for his analytical mind and his ability to assess situations quickly and accurately, skills that were now focused entirely on the drama unfolding on the training ground. "Ma'am," Rivera said quietly, his voice tight with controlled anger. "We need to address this immediately. What Thornfield just did is completely unacceptable." Colonel Mitchell remained silent, her jaw working as she processed not just what she had witnessed, but the implications of every possible response. She had known Marcus Thornfield for over a decade, had served with him on 2 previous assignments, and had always found him to be an effective, if old-fashioned officer. But what she had just observed crossed lines that she could never have imagined him crossing. The legal ramifications alone, ... Major Foster began, then trailed off as she watched Isabella's broken posture below. Foster had graduated from Harvard Law School before joining the military, and she could already envision the complex web of charges, investigations, and potential court-martial proceedings that this single moment might generate. Sergeant Major Chen's hands were clenched behind his back, his knuckles white with tension. "Colonel, I've known Isabella Chen since she was a private. She's one of the finest non-commissioned officers I've ever served with. What just happened down there, ... He paused, struggling to maintain his professional composure. "That's not discipline. That's abuse of power, plain and simple." Captain Torres had been taking notes on a small pad, his intelligence training kicking in automatically. "Ma'am, there are approximately 43 witnesses to what just occurred, including 3 other officers and 2 civilian contractors. This isn't something that can be swept under the rug or handled quietly." The group continued to watch as the training resumed below, their collective anger growing as they observed the studied indifference of everyone on the ground. Colonel Mitchell's hands gradually tightened on the windowsill until her knuckles matched the color of Sergeant Major Chen's. 28 years, Mitchell said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. 28 years I've been fighting to prove that women belong in the military, that we can lead just as effectively as our male counterparts, that we deserve the same respect and opportunities. Her voice grew stronger as she continued. And in 30 seconds, that bastard just undid decades of progress. Lieutenant Colonel Rivera nodded grimly. Isabella represents everything positive about the modern military. She's competent, dedicated, respected by her troops, and she's earned every bit of authority she wields. For Thornfield to humiliate her like that, in front of her own soldiers. He shook his head. Unable to finish the sentence, Major Foster was already making mental notes about the investigation that would need to be launched. "We'll need to interview every witness, document the incident thoroughly, and ensure that both Isabella and the recruits who saw this understand that they can speak freely without fear of retaliation. The ripple effects of this will extend far beyond just Isabella," Captain Torres observed. "Every female soldier on this base will hear about what happened within hours. If they see that we don't respond appropriately, it sends a message about what kind of treatment they can expect." Sergeant Major Chen turned from the window to face Colonel Mitchell directly. "Ma'am, with all due respect, this isn't just about military justice or gender equality. This is about the fundamental values that this institution is supposed to represent. Honor, integrity, respect for the dignity of every soldier. What happens next will define what kind of leaders we are." Colonel Mitchell continued to stare down at the training ground, where Isabella still stood in her diminished posture while Captain Thornfield surveyed his domain with obvious satisfaction. The contrast between the two figures, one broken but trying to maintain dignity, the other swollen with unearned pride, crystallized everything that was wrong with this moment. "How long have we been watching this?" Mitchell asked suddenly. "About 4 minutes, Torres replied, checking his watch. 4 minutes, Mitchell repeated slowly. 4 minutes of watching one of our finest officers be humiliated and degraded while everyone else pretends it didn't happen. She turned from the window, her expression hardening into something that her staff had learned to recognize as dangerous. "Gentlemen, Major Foster, I think it's time we reminded everyone on this base what real leadership looks like." The group exchanged glances, understanding that they were about to witness Colonel Mitchell in action, a prospect that was both inspiring and slightly terrifying for those who knew her reputation for swift, decisive justice. What none of them realized was that their intervention was about to transform a moment of injustice into a defining moment for the entire base. The administrative building's main entrance doors burst open with a force that seemed to shake the very foundations of Fort Meridian. Colonel Sarah Mitchell emerged first, her stride purposeful and measured, each step echoing with the authority of 3 decades of military service. Her silver eagles gleamed in the harsh Nevada sunlight as she descended the concrete steps. Her face sat in an expression that every soldier on the base had learned to recognize as the calm before a devastating storm. Behind her, Lieutenant Colonel Rivera matched her pace, his own bearing rigid with barely contained fury. Major Foster followed, her legal mind already cataloging every detail for the investigation that would surely follow. Sergeant Major Chen's boots struck the pavement with the rhythm of a man who had marched across 3 continents and 2 wars, while Captain Torres brought up the rear, his intelligence officer's eyes scanning the entire scene with analytical precision. The small convoy of senior officers moved across the base with the kind of purposeful momentum that made junior enlisted personnel instinctively step aside, straighten their uniforms. Soldiers working on vehicle maintenance stopped their activities to watch the unprecedented procession. Administrative staff peered out from office windows, sensing that something significant was about to unfold. As the group approached the training compound, Colonel Mitchell's presence began to register with those on the periphery of the exercise area. First, a communications specialist working on radio equipment noticed the approaching figures and immediately stood at attention. Then a supply sergeant delivering equipment to a nearby storage facility caught sight of the colonel's eagles and hastily set down his clipboard to render a proper salute. The ripple effect spread outward like stones thrown into still water. One by one, personnel throughout the area began to take notice of the senior command staff's approach. Master Sergeant Williams, who had been steadfastly avoiding eye contact with Isabella's position, suddenly found his attention drawn to the administrative building entrance. His eyes widened as he recognized Colonel Mitchell's distinctive bearing and purposeful stride. "Oh, shit," Williams muttered under his breath, a comment that would normally have earned him a sharp reprimand for profanity on the training ground. But the circumstances were far from normal, and even his nearby subordinates seemed too focused on the approaching command staff to notice his breach of protocol. Private Martinez, still mechanically working his way through the obstacle course, was the first recruit to spot the incoming group. His rope climbing exercise came to an abrupt halt as he processed the sight of the base's senior leadership bearing down on their location with obvious intent. The young soldier's mouth fell open slightly as he counted the ranked insignia approaching, more collective authority than he had ever seen assembled in one place outside of formal ceremonies. "Holy hell," whispered Private Rodriguez to no one in particular, his own training forgotten as he watched the unprecedented scene unfold. The recruit had been at Fort Meridian for only 6 weeks, but even his limited experience told him that colonels didn't normally make unscheduled visits to routine training exercises, especially not accompanied by half the base's senior staff. Lieutenant Patricia Hayes, who had been maintaining her studied indifference near her Humvee, felt her stomach drop as she recognized the approaching figures. Hayes had served under Colonel Mitchell on a previous assignment and knew the woman's reputation for swift, uncompromising justice. The lieutenant's clipboard slipped from suddenly nerveless fingers, clattering against the vehicle's bumper with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the desert air. Captain Thornfield, still basking in the satisfaction of having reasserted his authority, remained oblivious to the approaching storm. He continued to survey the training area with the air of a feudal lord reviewing his domain, occasionally barking orders at recruits whose performance he deemed inadequate. His back was turned to the administrative building, and his attention remained focused on finding additional opportunities to demonstrate his power. The base chaplain, Major Phillips, who had been frozen in moral paralysis near the communications tower, felt a surge of something that might have been relief as he watched Colonel Mitchell's approach. Phillips had served alongside Mitchell during the humanitarian crisis in Haiti and had witnessed her unwavering commitment to protecting those under her command. For the first time since witnessing Isabella's humiliation, he allowed himself to hope that justice might actually prevail. Even the civilian contractors working on the communications equipment seemed to sense the shift in the atmosphere. Their conversations died away as they noticed the sudden tension among the uniformed personnel around them. Without understanding the specific military protocols involved, they could still recognize the signs of an impending confrontation. Sergeant First Class Thompson, who had been conducting weapons training with increased volume to distract from the main drama, found his voice faltering as he caught sight of the approaching command staff. Thompson had 20 years of service and had never seen such a concentration of senior leadership descending on a routine training exercise. His weapons instruction devolved into nervous stammering as he tried to maintain focus while tracking the colonel's progress across the compound. The maintenance crew that had been busying themselves with urgent tasks in the opposite direction suddenly found their work far less compelling than the drama beginning to unfold behind them. Corporal Davis, Isabella's longtime friend, felt his hands shake as he pretended to check fluid levels while stealing glances at the approaching officers. Isabella herself, still standing in her diminished posture where Thornfield had left her, remained unaware of the approaching intervention. Her focus was turned inward as she struggled to process the humiliation and find a way to salvage her authority with her troops. The sound of approaching footsteps was lost in the general noise of the training compound, and her own internal turmoil. As Colonel Mitchell drew closer to the training area, her pace never wavered, but her expression grew increasingly thunderous. The other officers in her group matched her stride perfectly, presenting a united front of senior leadership that commanded attention and respect from everyone in their path. The distance between the approaching command staff and the scene of the assault continued to shrink with each purposeful step. What had started as a routine day of training exercises was about to become something that would be remembered and discussed at Fort Meridian for years to come. The moment of reckoning was less than 30 seconds away. Captain Marcus Thornfield. Colonel Mitchell's voice cut across the training compound like a saber through silk, sharp and unmistakable in its authority. The sound carried with such force that it seemed to freeze every moving figure on the base. From the recruits mid-climb on the obstacle course to the maintenance workers pretending to be busy with their equipment, Thornfield spun around, his satisfied smirk evaporating instantly as he took in the sight of the base's entire senior command staff arrayed before him like a military tribunal. The color drained from his weathered face as he processed the expressions of barely controlled fury etched on each officer's features. Colonel Mitchell stood at the center of the group, her steel-gray eyes boring into him with an intensity that made his mouth go dry. "Colonel Mitchell, ma'am," Thornfield stammered, snapping to attention with reflexive precision despite the obvious confusion written across his features. I wasn't expecting that is. We're conducting routine training exercises as scheduled. I can see exactly what you've been conducting. Captain, Mitchell interrupted, her voice carrying the kind of controlled fury that was far more dangerous than any shouting match. She stepped closer to Thornfield, close enough that he could see the muscle twitching in her jaw as she fought to maintain professional composure. What I want to know is what possible justification you have for laying hands on one of my sergeants. The question hung in the desert air like a dropped grenade waiting to explode. Every person within earshot, recruits, training staff, civilian contractors, and maintenance personnel felt their breath catch as they realized that the base's commanding officer had witnessed everything. The careful pretense that nothing unusual had occurred crumbled instantly under the weight of official acknowledgement. Thornfield's eyes darted nervously around the training compound, as if searching for escape routes or allies who might support his position. Finding none, he attempted to summon his earlier confidence. "Ma'am, Sergeant Chen was displaying insubordinate behavior. She questioned my assessment of her squad's performance and showed disrespect for the chain of command. I was simply maintaining discipline and, by striking a subordinate." Lieutenant Colonel Rivera stepped forward, his own voice tight with barely restrained anger. "Captain, in 26 years of military service, I have never witnessed such a grotesque abuse of authority. What you did wasn't discipline. It was assault." Major Foster moved to Rivera's side, her legal training evident in the precise way she chose her words. "Captain Thornfield, you need to understand that what occurred here constitutes multiple violations of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Article 128, assault. Article 134, conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline. And depending on the circumstances, potentially Article 120, abusive sexual contact." Thornfield's face went from pale to ashen as the legal implications began to sink in. Sexual contact? That's absurd. I was enforcing military discipline, nothing more. Sergeant Chen was out of line, and I corrected her behavior using appropriate command authority. Sergeant Major Chen stepped forward, his 30 years of enlisted experience lending weight to every word. "Captain, I've served under dozens of officers in my career. I've seen real leadership, and I've seen petty tyrants who confuse fear with respect. What you did to Sergeant Chen wasn't leadership. It was the act of a man who's forgotten what the uniform represents." Isabella, who had been standing frozen since hearing her name called, slowly turned toward the confrontation unfolding nearby. The sight of the base's entire senior leadership defending her sent a shock of disbelief through her system. After feeling completely alone and powerless just minutes before, she found herself at the center of an intervention that she could never have imagined. Captain Torres, his intelligence officer's mind cataloging every detail, addressed Thornfield with clinical precision. "Captain, we observed the entire incident from the administrative building. We have visual confirmation of the assault, along with approximately 43 witnesses on the ground. This isn't a matter of conflicting testimony or unclear circumstances. We saw you strike Sergeant Chen across the face." The recruits who had been mechanically continuing their training exercises now stood openly gawking at the unprecedented scene. Private Martinez felt his heart pounding as he realized that the senior leadership had not only witnessed Isabella's humiliation but were actively confronting her attacker. The young soldier had never seen anything like this level of command intervention in response to enlisted personnel concerns. Staff Sergeant Williams, who had been avoiding eye contact with Isabella since the incident, now found himself caught between his earlier cowardice and the undeniable reality of command attention. He cleared his throat nervously, knowing that his own failure to intervene would likely be scrutinized along with Thornfield's actions. "Ma'am," Thornfield tried again, his voice taking on a desperate edge. perhaps we could discuss this matter privately. There may have been some misunderstanding about the nature of the correction I administered. In my experience, sometimes firm discipline is necessary to maintain unit cohesion, and there was no misunderstanding. Colonel Mitchell cut him off with surgical precision. We observed you strike Sergeant Chen across the face with sufficient force to leave a visible mark. We watched you humiliate one of this base's most accomplished non-commissioned officers in front of her own troops. And most disgustingly, we witnessed you doing all of this with obvious satisfaction. Lieutenant Patricia Hayes, who had been paralyzed by the potential career implications of intervention, now felt a different kind of fear as she realized that the senior leadership's response would likely extend to everyone who had witnessed the assault and failed to act. The lieutenant's hands trembled as she considered how her own inaction might be viewed by Colonel Mitchell's investigation. The civilian contractors had stopped all pretense of working and were now openly watching the confrontation, their presence adding another layer of complexity to an already volatile situation. The fact that non-military personnel had witnessed the assault would make any attempt at internal resolution virtually impossible. Even the base chaplain, Major Phillips, felt his earlier moral paralysis giving way to something approaching hope as he watched the uncompromising stance taken by the command staff. Phillips had been struggling with how to reconcile his spiritual calling with military protocol. But the colonel's intervention suggested that there were still leaders willing to prioritize justice over convenience. Captain Thornfield, Colonel Mitchell continued, her voice dropping to a deadly quiet that was somehow more intimidating than any shout. You are hereby relieved of your training duties pending a full investigation. You will report to my office immediately following this conversation, where you will provide a written statement explaining your actions. Major Foster will read you your rights under Article 31 of the UCMJ. Before that interview begins. The finality in Mitchell's voice made it clear that this was not a KEO negotiation or a warning. It was the beginning of the end of Marcus Thornfield's military career. The transformation that swept across the training compound was immediate and profound, like watching a tide reverse its course in real time. Where moments before there had been studied indifference and complicit silence, now there was a palpable shift in the very atmosphere of Fort Meridian. The presence of senior command had not only changed the dynamic, it had completely inverted the power structure that had seemed so absolute under Thornfield's abuse. Colonel Mitchell turned away from the now subdued Thornfield and walked directly toward Isabella, her stride conveying both authority and compassion. As she approached, Isabella instinctively began to straighten her posture, military training overriding the emotional turmoil that had left her diminished just minutes before. The colonel's approach was deliberate and respectful, clearly intended to restore dignity rather than assert dominance. Sergeant Chen, Mitchell said as she came to a stop in front of Isabella, her voice carrying across the training ground with crystal clarity. On behalf of the United States Army and the leadership of Fort Meridian, I offer you a formal apology for what you have endured today. What happened to you was completely unacceptable and contrary to every value this institution represents. The words hit Isabella like a physical force, and she felt her carefully maintained composure finally begin to crack, not from shame or pain this time, but from relief so overwhelming it threatened to buckle her knees. "Ma'am, she began, then stopped, unsure how to process the complete reversal of her circumstances. You have nothing to apologize for, Colonel Mitchell continued, her voice firm but gentle. You conducted yourself with professionalism and restraint in the face of inexcusable abuse. Your response to Captain Thornfield's assault demonstrated exactly the kind of character and discipline we expect from our non-commissioned officers." Lieutenant Colonel Rivera stepped forward, adding his voice to the colonel's restoration of Isabella's dignity. Sergeant Chen, I've read your performance evaluations, your combat citations, and the recommendations from your previous commanders. You are exactly the kind of leader this army needs. And what happened here today in no way reflects on your capabilities or your worth as a soldier. The 43 recruits and training staff who had witnessed Isabella's humiliation now found themselves watching an equally public restoration of her honor. Private Martinez felt tears welling in his eyes as he saw his sergeant, the woman who had mentored him through his most difficult weeks of training, being treated with the respect she had always deserved. The contrast with the earlier scene was so stark it felt like watching a completely different universe unfold. Sergeant Major Chen approached Isabella with the bearing of a man who had spent 3 decades evaluating soldiers and leaders. Sergeant, I want you to know that your conduct under these circumstances has been exemplary. Lesser soldiers would have responded to such provocation with violence or breakdown. You maintained your professionalism even when your superior failed to maintain his. Major Foster, understanding the legal implications of what was unfolding, addressed Isabella with careful precision. Sergeant Chen, as the base's legal officer, I want to ensure you understand that you are the victim in this situation, not a participant in any misconduct. You will have full legal support throughout the investigation process, and there will be no retaliation for your cooperation with our inquiry. The public nature of this restoration was clearly intentional. Just as Thornfield had chosen to humiliate Isabella in front of witnesses, Colonel Mitchell was ensuring that her vindication was equally visible to everyone present. The message being sent was unmistakable. Abuse of power would not be tolerated, and those who stood up to it would be protected and honored. Staff Sergeant Williams, who had been among those who failed to intervene during the assault, now stepped forward with obvious shame etched on his features. Sergeant Chen, I owe you an apology as well. I should have spoken up immediately when Captain Thornfield struck you. My failure to act was cowardly and wrong. His admission seemed to break a dam among the other training staff. Sergeant First Class Thompson approached next, his voice heavy with regret. Sergeant, I've served with you for 2 years. I've seen your leadership, your courage, your dedication to these recruits. I should have defended you immediately, and I failed you as both a fellow NCO and as a human being. One by one, other members of the training staff began to approach Isabella, each offering their own apologies for their failure to intervene. The scene that unfolded was unprecedented in most of their experienced senior enlisted personnel publicly acknowledging their moral failures and expressing genuine remorse for their actions. Even Lieutenant Hayes, despite her fears about career implications, stepped forward to add her voice to the chorus of support. Sergeant Chen, what Captain Thornfield did was wrong, and what we all did by standing by and watching was equally wrong. You deserved better from all of us. The recruits, watching this extraordinary display of accountability and moral courage from their leaders, were receiving an education in military values that no classroom instruction could have provided. Private Rodriguez would later tell his family that watching the senior leadership defend Isabella while the rest of the base acknowledged their failures taught him more about honor and integrity than any manual or lecture ever could. Captain Torres, ever the intelligence officer, was documenting not just the formal aspects of the situation, but the remarkable transformation in unit, morale and cohesion that was occurring in real time. The public restoration of Isabella's dignity was creating a teaching moment that would resonate throughout Fort Meridian. For years to come, Isabella herself seemed almost overwhelmed by the sudden reversal of her circumstances. The red mark on her cheek remained as evidence of Thornfield's assault, but her posture had completely transformed. Where she had stood diminished and broken just minutes before, she now stood tall, surrounded by the support and respect of the base's leadership. Sergeant Chen, Colonel Mitchell said, her voice carrying to every corner of the training ground. I want every person present to understand something clearly. You represent the best of what this army can be. Your dedication, your professionalism, your courage under fire, and your grace under pressure are exactly what we need from our non-commissioned officers. Captain Thornfield's actions today were not a reflection of your shortcomings. They were a reflection of his own moral failures. The colonel's words carried the weight of official policy, making it clear that Isabella's reputation and career were not only intact but officially endorsed by the highest levels of command. The humiliation that had seemed so absolute just minutes before had been completely transformed into vindication and honor. What none of them could have predicted was how this moment of justice would continue to ripple outward, affecting not just Isabella and Thornfield, but the entire culture of Fort Meridian itself. The transformation of power dynamics on the training compound created a space where stories that had been buried under military protocol and fear could finally surface. As Isabella stood surrounded by the protective circle of senior leadership, her own voice began to return, not the broken whisper that had followed Thornfield's assault, but the clear, confident tone that had earned her the respect of soldiers and officers alike. "Colonel Mitchell," Isabella said, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of the moment. "What happened today wasn't an isolated incident. Captain Thornfield has been challenging my authority and undermining my leadership for months. This was just the first time he crossed the line into physical violence." The admission sent ripples of tension through the assembled group. Lieutenant Colonel Rivera's jaw tightened as he processed the implications of Isabella's statement. "Sergeant, are you saying there's been a pattern of harassment?" Isabella nodded slowly, the words coming easier now that she felt safe to speak truth to power. "Sir, Captain Thornfield has repeatedly questioned my methods in front of my troops, made comments about women not belonging in combat roles, and consistently assigned me the most difficult training scenarios while providing inadequate resources. He's also made several inappropriate comments about my appearance and suggested that I've only advanced through the ranks because of special considerations." Major Foster immediately stepped closer, her legal training kicking into high gear. "Sergeant Chen, these allegations constitute potential violations of equal opportunity policies and sexual harassment regulations. Have you documented any of these incidents?" "I've kept detailed notes in my personal log, ma'am," Isabella replied. "I also have witnesses to several of the incidents, including Staff Sergeant Williams and Sergeant Thompson. I've been reluctant to report them because ... She paused, glancing around at the faces surrounding her. "Because I was afraid it would be seen as weakness, as an inability to handle difficult leadership." The confession hung in the desert air like a condemnation of the military culture that had forced Isabella to suffer in silence rather than seek help. Sergeant Major Chun's expression darkened as he realized the broader implications of what Isabella was revealing. "Jesus Christ," muttered Staff Sergeant Williams, forgetting protocol in his shock. "Sergeant, why didn't you come to me? I would have backed you up. We all would have." Isabella's smile was bitter and knowing. "Would you, Sergeant Williams? Because when Captain Thornfield struck me 20 minutes ago, you were 30 feet away, and you chose to focus on your own training responsibilities instead of intervening." The words hit Williams like a physical blow, and his face reddened with shame. But Isabella wasn't finished. Her voice grew stronger as months of suppressed frustration finally found an outlet. "I've spent 3 years on this base proving myself over and over again," she continued, addressing not just the senior leadership but everyone within earshot. "I've led successful training exercises, mentored dozens of recruits, earned commendations for my performance, and maintained unit readiness scores that consistently exceed base averages. But none of that mattered to Captain Thornfield because he could never see past my gender. Private Martinez, still standing at his position on the obstacle course, felt his understanding of military dynamics shifting fundamentally as he listened to Isabella speak. The sergeant he had admired for her strength and competence was revealing the constant battles she had fought just to maintain her position, battles that he, as a male recruit, would never have to face. Captain Torres was taking extensive notes, recognizing that Isabella's testimony was painting a picture of systemic issues that extended far beyond a single moment of violence. Sergeant Chen, are there other female personnel on the base who have experienced similar treatment from Captain Thornfield? Isabella hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Yes, sir. Corporal Jessica Martinez in logistics has mentioned similar issues, and I believe Lieutenant Hayes has also had difficulties with the captain's leadership style. All eyes turned to Lieutenant Hayes, who had gone pale at being directly named. The young officer's hands trembled slightly as she realized she was being called upon to add her voice to the growing chorus of accusations against Thornfield. Lieutenant Hayes, Colonel Mitchell said gently but firmly, "This is a safe space to speak truthfully about your experiences. You will face no retaliation for honest testimony." Hayes took a deep breath, her voice shaky but determined. "Ma'am, Captain Thornfield has repeatedly questioned my fitness reports, suggested that I was promoted too quickly because of diversity initiatives, and has made several comments about my physical appearance during official meetings. He's also assigned me to administrative duties far below my pay grade while giving more challenging assignments to male officers with less experience." The pattern that emerged from these testimonies painted a clear picture of an officer who had used his position to systematically harass and intimidate female personnel under his command. What had seemed like an isolated moment of violence was revealing itself to be the culmination of months or possibly years of discriminatory behavior. Sergeant First Class Thompson stepped forward, his voice heavy with regret. "Colonel, I need to add something to this record. I've heard Captain Thornfield make inappropriate comments about female soldiers on multiple occasions. He's referred to integration as social experimentation, and has suggested that women in combat roles put male soldiers at risk. I should have reported these comments through proper channels." More voices began to join the growing testimony. Corporal Davis, Isabella's longtime friend, stepped forward despite his earlier cowardice. "Ma'am, I've witnessed Captain Thornfield's treatment of Sergeant Chen firsthand. He's consistently held her to higher standards than male NCOs, and has publicly criticized her methods while privately implementing similar approaches in his own units." Even some of the recruits began to speak up, their young voices adding weight to the mounting evidence. Private Rodriguez raised his hand tentatively for speaking. "Ma'am, during our first week of training, Captain Thornfield told us that female instructors would go easier on us because of their maternal instincts, but that we shouldn't expect that kind of treatment in real combat situations." The picture that emerged was devastating in its clarity. Captain Thornfield hadn't simply lost his temper in a moment of poor judgment. He had been conducting a systematic campaign of discrimination and harassment against female personnel under his command. The physical assault on Isabella was merely the most visible manifestation of a pattern of behavior that had been poisoning the command climate for months. Colonel Mitchell's expression grew, increasingly grim as each new piece of testimony added to the growing case against Thornfield. What had started as a response to a single incident was rapidly evolving into a comprehensive investigation of command failure and systemic discrimination. "Major Foster," Mitchell said quietly, "I want a full investigation launched immediately. Interview every person who has served under Captain Thornfield's command in the past year. Document every incident, every witness statement, every piece of evidence that might be relevant." As the scope of Thornfield's misconduct became clear, Isabella found herself at the center of something much larger than personal vindication. Her courage in speaking out was opening the door for others to share their own experiences, creating a collective voice that could no longer be ignored or silenced. The desert sun continued to beat down on Fort Meridian, but the atmosphere had fundamentally changed. Truth was finally being spoken, and justice was beginning to take shape. The revelation of Captain Thornfield's systematic harassment sent shockwaves through every level of Fort Meridian's hierarchy. But nowhere was the impact more profound than among the witnesses who had remained silent during Isabella's assault. As the testimonies continued to pour forth, painting an increasingly damning picture of institutional failure, the weight of collective complicity began to settle on everyone present like a suffocating blanket. Staff Sergeant Williams found himself at the epicenter of this moral reckoning. As a 15-year veteran and senior non-commissioned officer, his failure to intervene when Isabella was struck carried implications that extended far beyond personal cowardice. The younger soldiers under his supervision looked to him for guidance on military values and proper conduct, and his inaction had sent a devastating message about what behavior was acceptable in the Army. "Colonel Mitchell," Williams said, his voice cracking with emotion, "I need to make something clear for the record. When Captain Thornfield struck Sergeant Chen, I had a clear view of the entire incident. I knew it was wrong. I knew it was assault, and I knew I had a duty to intervene. I chose not to act because I was afraid of the career implications of confronting a superior officer." He paused, struggling to continue. "My cowardice today has dishonored every value this uniform represents." The admission sent ripples of discomfort through the assembled personnel. Williams wasn't just confessing to personal failure, he was articulating the fear that had paralyzed dozens of witnesses to Thornfield's abuse. His words forced everyone present to confront their own moral compromises and the systemic pressures that had enabled the harassment to continue unchecked. Private Martinez, still processing the sergeant's confession, felt his understanding of military leadership undergoing a fundamental transformation. The young soldier had been taught that non-commissioned officers were the backbone of the Army, that they could be counted on to do the right thing even when it was difficult. Williams's admission shattered that idealistic view and replaced it with a more complex understanding of how institutional pressures could corrupt even well-intentioned leaders. Lieutenant Hayes, emboldened by Williams's honesty, stepped forward to add her own confession to the growing catalog of institutional failure. "Ma'am, I want to acknowledge that I also failed Sergeant Chen today. As the only other female officer present, I had a special responsibility to speak up when I witnessed gender-based harassment. Instead, I prioritized my own career concerns over basic human decency." Her words carried particular weight because they highlighted how the military's hierarchical structure had created impossible choices for junior personnel. Hayes had been caught between her moral obligations and her professional survival, forced to choose between doing what was right and protecting her own future in an institution where retaliation against whistleblowers was an unspoken reality. Sergeant First Class Thompson, who had been conducting weapons training during the assault, found himself compelled to add his voice to the chorus of confession. "Colonel, I need to state for the record that I heard the sound of Captain Thornfield striking Sergeant Chen from 30 yards away. I deliberately increased the volume of my instruction to cover the incident and avoid having to acknowledge what had happened. My actions helped create an atmosphere where abuse could occur without consequence." The domino effect of these confessions was creating something unprecedented in most of the witnesses' military experience. Senior leaders were publicly acknowledging their moral failures, creating a space for honest reflection about how institutional culture had prioritized order and hierarchy over justice and human dignity. Even the civilian contractors, who had no official obligation to intervene in military disciplinary matters, began to speak up about their own discomfort with what they had witnessed. Jim Patterson, a communications technician with 20 years of experience working on military bases, raised his hand tentatively before addressing Colonel Mitchell. "Ma'am, I know I'm not military, but I've worked on Army installations for 2 decades, and I've never seen anything like what Captain Thornfield did to that sergeant. In my civilian job, striking a subordinate would be grounds for immediate termination and criminal charges. The fact that so many people with military training stood by and watched it happen suggests there are serious problems with how this institution handles abuse of power." Patterson's observation, coming from an outsider's perspective, carried particular force because it highlighted how military culture had normalized behaviors that would be unacceptable in civilian workplaces. His words forced the assembled personnel to consider how their professional environment had gradually eroded their moral standards through a process of incremental compromise. The base chaplain, Major Phillips, finally found his voice after struggling with the intersection of his spiritual calling and military obligations. "Colonel Mitchell, I failed Sergeant Chen, and I failed my calling today. As a chaplain, I'm supposed to be an advocate for the moral and spiritual welfare of all personnel on this base. When I witnessed the assault, I was paralyzed by concerns about maintaining my position within the command structure. I chose institutional loyalty over moral courage, and that choice makes me complicit in the abuse." Phillips's confession was particularly devastating because chaplains were supposed to represent the moral conscience of the military community. His admission that he had prioritized institutional concerns over spiritual obligations highlighted how thoroughly the base's culture had been corrupted by fear and complicity. The military police officers who had been conducting their routine patrol during the incident also came forward to acknowledge their failure. Sergeant Mike Foster, a 10-year veteran of the MPs, stepped out of his patrol vehicle and approached the group with obvious reluctance. "Ma'am, I observed the assault from approximately 50 yards away," Foster reported, his voice heavy with shame. "I had both the authority and the obligation to investigate the incident immediately. Instead, I chose to continue my patrol because I didn't want to get involved in what I assumed was a command discipline issue. My failure to act allowed a criminal assault to go unchallenged." As each confession added to the mounting evidence of institutional failure, the scope of the problem became increasingly clear. This wasn't just about one abusive officer or a few cowardly bystanders. It was about a systemic culture that had prioritized maintaining the appearance of order over protecting vulnerable personnel from abuse. The medical officer, Captain Susan Park, emerged from her nearby office to add her own testimony to the growing record. "Colonel, I observed the aftermath of the assault from my window and could see the injury to Sergeant Chen's face. As a medical officer, I had both the professional obligation to treat potential injuries and the moral obligation to report suspected abuse. I failed to act on either obligation because I was concerned about the political implications of challenging a superior officer's disciplinary actions." The pattern that emerged from these confessions painted a picture of an institution where moral courage had been systematically eroded by a culture of fear, careerism, and willful blindness. Everyone present was being forced to confront how they had contributed to an environment where abuse could flourish unchecked. Colonel Mitchell listened to each confession with growing gravity, understanding that what she was witnessing represented both a crisis and an opportunity for fundamental reform of the base's culture and leadership standards. The cascade of confessions and revelations had exposed the depth of institutional rot at Fort Meridian. But Colonel Mitchell understood that acknowledgement of failure was only the first step toward meaningful change. As the desert sun reached its zenith, casting harsh shadows across the training compound, she began to implement a series of immediate actions that would transform not just Isabella's circumstances, but the entire culture of the base. "Effective immediately," Colonel Mitchell announced. her voice carrying with the authority of command decision. Captain Thornfield is suspended from all duties pending the completion of a full investigation. He will surrender his access cards, weapons, and command responsibilities to Sergeant Major Chen within the next hour. The finality in her tone made it clear that this wasn't a temporary disciplinary measure. It was the beginning of the end of Thornfield's military career. But Mitchell wasn't finished with her immediate reforms. Furthermore, she continued, I am establishing a new protocol for Fort Meridian that will be implemented across all units. Any personnel who witness harassment, discrimination, or abuse of any kind are required to report it immediately through multiple channels. We will create an environment where speaking up is not just encouraged, it is mandated. Lieutenant Colonel Rivera stepped forward to add specifics to the Colonel's directive. We're implementing an immediate open-door policy with senior command. Any soldier, regardless of rank, can request a meeting with myself or Colonel Mitchell without going through their chain of command. We're also establishing an anonymous reporting system that will be monitored directly by Major Foster's legal office. Major Foster nodded, her legal mind already working through the practical implementation of these changes. Additionally, we're instituting mandatory training for all personnel on recognizing and responding to harassment and discrimination. This won't be a one-time briefing. It will be ongoing education that becomes part of our regular professional development. But the most significant change came when Colonel Mitchell turned her attention to Isabella's immediate circumstances. Sergeant Chen, I am personally recommending you for the Army Commendation Medal for your professionalism and restraint under extreme provocation. Your conduct today demonstrates exactly the kind of leadership we need from our non-commissioned officers. Isabella felt her breath catch as the Colonel continued. More importantly, I am offering you a choice regarding your future assignment. If you wish to remain at Fort Meridian, you will be assigned to work directly with my staff on implementing our new anti-harassment protocols. Your experience and perspective will be invaluable in ensuring these changes are effective and sustainable. The offer represented something unprecedented, a victim of institutional abuse being elevated to a position where she could directly influence systemic reform. It was a concrete demonstration that speaking truth to power would be rewarded rather than punished. Alternatively, Mitchell continued, if you prefer a fresh start, I will personally ensure your transfer to any assignment of your choosing, with my highest recommendation and full endorsement of your leadership capabilities. The choice is entirely yours, Sergeant. Isabella's response was immediate and resolute. Ma'am, I would be honored to remain at Fort Meridian and help implement these changes. If my experience today can prevent other soldiers from facing similar abuse, then it will have served a purpose. The decision sent a powerful message throughout the assembled personnel that victims of harassment wouldn't be quietly transferred away to protect institutional reputation, but would instead be empowered to lead reform efforts. Sergeant Major Chen stepped forward with his own announcement. Colonel, I recommend that we immediately establish a mentorship program pairing senior female personnel with junior soldiers. We need to create support networks that will prevent isolation and provide advocacy for those who might otherwise suffer in silence. Colonel Mitchell nodded approvingly. Excellent suggestion, Sergeant Major. I want that program operational within 2 weeks. I also want us to review every performance evaluation written by Captain Thornfield in the past year. If we find evidence that female personnel were unfairly assessed, we will correct those records and ensure any negative impacts on their careers are remedied. The scope of the changes being implemented was staggering. What had begun as a response to a single assault was evolving into a comprehensive overhaul of base policies and culture. But Mitchell wasn't content with administrative changes alone. She was determined to address the human cost of the institutional failures that had been exposed. Staff Sergeant Williams, she said, Turning to the senior NCO who had confessed his cowardice, "You will be enrolled in leadership counseling and will write a formal essay on moral courage that will be distributed to all non-commissioned officers on this base. Your failure today will become a teaching tool to prevent similar failures in the future." Williams straightened to attention, relief evident on his face that he was being given an opportunity for redemption rather than simply being punished. "Yes, ma'am. I understand completely." Lieutenant Hayes received similar treatment, with Mitchell assigning her to work directly with Major Foster on developing new equal opportunity training materials. "Your experience as a female officer who felt unable to speak up will help us create training that addresses the real-world pressures our personnel face. Even the civilian contractors weren't forgotten in Mitchell's comprehensive response. "Mr. Patterson," she said, addressing the communications technician who had spoken up, "I'm requesting that your company provide training to our civilian workforce on recognizing and reporting workplace harassment. Your outside perspective has been valuable today, and we want to ensure all personnel on this base understand their role in maintaining professional standards." The medical officer, Captain Park, was tasked with developing new protocols for recognizing and documenting signs of workplace harassment and abuse. "We need our medical personnel to understand that they serve as both healers and potential advocates for victims of institutional abuse." As each person received their role in the broader reform effort, a transformation was occurring in real time. The culture of fear and silence that had enabled Thornfield's abuse was being systematically dismantled and replaced with structures of accountability and support. The base chaplain, Major Phillips, was assigned to develop spiritual and ethical counseling programs that would help personnel navigate the moral complexities of military service without compromising their fundamental values. "We need to ensure that our spiritual leaders are equipped to provide guidance when military obligations conflict with moral imperatives." But perhaps the most significant long-term change was Mitchell's announcement that Fort Meridian would become a pilot program for Army-wide reforms. "What we implement here will be studied and potentially adopted across the entire service. We have an opportunity to influence military culture far beyond our own base." The announcement transformed Isabella's ordeal from a personal tragedy into a catalyst for institutional change that could affect thousands of soldiers throughout the Army. Her courage in speaking up was creating ripple effects that would extend far beyond the desert training grounds of Fort Meridian. As the immediate crisis began to transform into organized reform, it became clear that this day would be remembered not for the moment when an officer abused his power, but for the moment when an institution chose to confront its failures and commit to fundamental change. Immediate crisis management and structural reforms implemented by Colonel Mitchell addressed the institutional failures at Fort Meridian. But the deeper transformation occurring that day spoke to fundamental truths about human dignity, moral courage, and the true meaning of military service that would resonate far beyond the boundaries of any single base or branch of service. As the desert afternoon began its transition toward evening, the assembled personnel found themselves witnesses to something rare and profound, a moment when abstract principles of honor and integrity were made concrete through decisive action. The contrast between Captain Thornfield's abuse of power and Colonel Mitchell's moral leadership created a stark illustration of the two paths available to anyone entrusted with authority over others. Private Martinez, still processing everything he had witnessed, began to understand that his military education was receiving a lesson that no classroom or manual could provide. The young soldier realized he was observing the difference between leadership that derives its power from fear and intimidation, and leadership that earns its authority through moral courage and genuine care for subordinates. The impact of this distinction would shape his approach to leadership for the remainder of his military career. Isabella herself, standing at the center of this transformation, embodied a powerful truth about the nature of true strength. Her refusal to respond to Thornfield's assault with violence or breakdown, combined with her willingness to speak honestly about the systematic harassment she had endured, demonstrated that real courage often manifests not in dramatic gestures, but in quiet persistence and moral clarity under pressure. What we've witnessed today, Colonel Mitchell addressed the assembled group, her voice carrying the weight of 3 decades of military experience, illustrates a fundamental principle that every soldier, regardless of rank or specialty, must understand. The uniform we wear represents more than national service. It represents a commitment to values that transcend individual ambition or personal convenience. Her words carried beyond the immediate audience to encompass broader questions about institutional integrity and individual responsibility. The events at Fort Meridian had revealed how easily organizations could drift from their stated values when those values conflicted with perceived self-interest or institutional convenience. Sergeant Major Chen, drawing from his 30 years of enlisted experience, added his perspective to the emerging lesson. Today demonstrated that rank and authority mean nothing without moral foundation. Captain Thornfield had the legal right to discipline soldiers under his command, but he lost any moral authority to lead the moment he allowed his personal prejudices to override his professional obligations. The distinction between legal authority and moral legitimacy resonated powerfully with everyone present. They had witnessed how quickly authority without moral foundation could transform into tyranny, and how essential it was for institutions to maintain mechanisms for challenging and correcting such abuse. Lieutenant Colonel Rivera addressed the broader implications of what they had experienced. This incident illustrates why diversity and inclusion aren't just policy requirements, they're operational necessities. An institution that systematically excludes or marginalizes capable personnel based on irrelevant characteristics weakens itself and fails in its mission to serve effectively. His observation connected the day's events to larger questions about organizational effectiveness and social justice. The harassment of Isabella and other female personnel wasn't just morally wrong, it was operationally destructive, undermining unit cohesion and wasting valuable human resources. Major Foster, speaking from her legal and ethical perspective, emphasized the relationship between individual actions and collective responsibility. Today showed us that institutional culture isn't created by policies and regulations alone. It's shaped by the daily choices made by every person within the organization. When good people choose silence in the face of wrongdoing, they become complicit in that wrongdoing. Her words highlighted one of the most uncomfortable truths revealed by the day's events, that most of the personnel present weren't inherently bad people, but they had allowed institutional pressures and personal fears to override their moral instincts. The recognition of this complicity was painful but necessary for genuine reform. The civilian contractor, Jim Patterson, offered an outsider's perspective that provided additional clarity on the situation. What I observed today reminded me that military service, at its best, represents some of humanity's highest ideals: sacrifice for others, protection of the vulnerable, and commitment to principles larger than oneself. But it also showed how those same ideals can be corrupted when institutions prioritize self-preservation over moral courage. His words carried particular weight because they came from someone without institutional investment in the military's reputation. Patterson's willingness to speak honestly about what he had witnessed demonstrated that moral courage wasn't dependent on rank, training, or institutional loyalty. It was a fundamental human quality that could be exercised by anyone willing to prioritize truth over convenience. Isabella's own reflection on the day's events provided perhaps the most powerful lesson of all. What happened to me today was wrong, but what happened after Captain Thornfield struck me was equally important. Colonel Mitchell and her staff didn't just correct an injustice, they demonstrated that institutions can change, that speaking up can make a difference, and that victims of abuse don't have to suffer in silence or accept their circumstances as inevitable. Her words spoke to the transformative power of moral leadership and institutional accountability. The events at Fort Meridian had shown that even deeply entrenched cultures of fear and silence could be challenged and changed. When leaders were willing to prioritize justice over convenience, the broader lesson emerging from the day's events transcended military service entirely. The dynamics of power, abuse, complicity, and moral courage that had played out on the training ground were universal human experiences that occurred in workplaces, communities, and institutions throughout society. The principles demonstrated by Colonel Mitchell's intervention, that authority must be coupled with moral responsibility, that institutional loyalty cannot override basic human decency, and that speaking truth to power requires both courage and support, applied far beyond the military context. As the sun began its descent toward the Nevada horizon, casting long shadows across Fort Meridian, the assembled personnel understood that they had participated in something that would define their understanding of leadership, integrity, and moral courage for the rest of their lives. The day had begun with a moment of injustice, but it was ending with a renewed commitment to the values that gave meaning to their service and their lives. The transformation was complete, but its impact would continue to ripple outward for years to come. 6 months later, the transformation at Fort Meridian had become a model for military installations across the United States. The reforms implemented in the aftermath of Isabella's assault had not only changed the culture of the base, but had influenced Army-wide policies on harassment, prevention, and response. What began as a moment of individual courage had evolved into a comprehensive shift in how the military approached issues of dignity, respect, and institutional accountability. Isabella Chen, now promoted to Staff Sergeant, stood before a packed auditorium at the Pentagon, addressing a conference of senior military leaders from all branches of service. The red mark that had once marred her cheek was long gone, but the strength and dignity that had carried her through that difficult day had only grown stronger with time and recognition. 6 months ago, I was struck by a superior officer in front of 40 witnesses, Isabella began, her voice clear and confident as it carried to every corner of the room. That assault was just one moment in a pattern of harassment that had been ongoing for months. What made the difference wasn't just that the abuse was witnessed by senior leadership, was that those leaders chose to act with moral courage rather than institutional convenience. The audience of colonels, generals, and senior enlisted personnel listened with rapt attention as Isabella recounted not just the events of that day, but the systematic changes that had followed. Her presentation had become a cornerstone of the military's new approach to preventing and addressing workplace harassment. The investigation that followed revealed systematic discrimination not just against me, but against multiple female personnel on the base, Isabella continued. Captain Thornfield was court-martialed and dishonorably discharged. But more importantly, we implemented changes that addressed the cultural factors that had enabled his behavior to continue unchecked. The Pentagon conference room was filled with military leaders who had traveled from installations around the world to learn about the Fort Meridian model, a comprehensive approach to harassment prevention that had reduced incident reports by 70% while simultaneously increasing reporting rates, indicating that personnel felt safer coming forward with concerns. Colonel Mitchell, now wearing the eagles of a newly promoted brigadier general, took the podium to explain the broader institutional changes that had emerged from that day's events. What we learned at Fort Meridian is that preventing harassment isn't just about punishing perpetrators after the fact. It's about creating a culture where such behavior becomes unthinkable because it contradicts the fundamental values of the organization. The reforms implemented at Fort Meridian had become a case study in organizational transformation. The mandatory reporting protocols, the anonymous feedback systems, the mentorship programs, and the leadership accountability measures had all been refined and adapted for implementation across the Army. But perhaps most importantly, the base had become a place where moral courage was actively cultivated and rewarded. Private Martinez, now a corporal and one of the base's most promising young leaders, had become an advocate for the new culture at Fort Meridian. His own transformation from a silent witness to an active promoter of dignity and respect illustrated how individuals could grow when placed in an environment that valued moral courage over blind obedience. Watching Staff Sergeant Chen stand up to injustice taught me that real military bearing isn't about following orders without question, Martinez explained to a group of new recruits during orientation. It's about having the courage to do what's right, even when it's difficult or unpopular. The ripple effects of the Fort Meridian incident had extended far beyond military circles. Isabella's story had been featured in national media as an example of how institutions could respond effectively to harassment and discrimination. Her testimony before Congress had influenced federal legislation on workplace harassment prevention, and she had been invited to speak at universities and corporate conferences about creating cultures of respect and accountability. Staff Sergeant Williams, who had confessed his cowardice on that day 6 months earlier, had undergone his own transformation. His essay on moral courage had indeed been distributed throughout the Army and had become required reading for all non-commissioned officers. Williams had embraced his role as an example of how individuals could learn from their failures and become better leaders. My failure to act when Staff Sergeant Chen was assaulted taught me that neutrality in the face of injustice is complicity. Williams wrote in his widely circulated essay, "Leadership isn't just about giving orders, it's about creating an environment where every person under your command feels valued, protected, and empowered to reach their full potential." The civilian contractor Jim Patterson had worked with the Army to develop training materials that helped non-military personnel understand their role in maintaining professional standards on military installations. His outside perspective had proven invaluable in identifying blind spots that military personnel might miss due to their institutional training. Major Foster, now Lieutenant Colonel Foster, had been assigned to the Pentagon to help develop Army-wide policies based on the Fort Meridian experience. Her legal expertise, combined with her first-hand observation of the transformation, made her uniquely qualified to translate the lessons learned into practical policies that could be implemented across diverse military environments. The base chaplain, Major Phillips, had developed spiritual and ethical counseling programs that helped military personnel navigate complex moral situations without compromising their integrity. His work had been recognized by military chaplains across all services as a model for addressing the intersection of military duty and moral obligation, but perhaps the most powerful testament to the lasting impact of that day was the culture that had emerged at Fort Meridian itself. The base had become known throughout the Army as a place where personnel of all backgrounds could serve with dignity and respect. Recruitment and retention rates had improved dramatically, and the base consistently scored at the top of Army-wide surveys measuring unit cohesion and morale. The story of Fort Meridian proves that change is possible, Isabella concluded her Pentagon presentation. It shows that individuals can make a difference, that institutions can reform themselves, and that moral courage, once demonstrated, can inspire others to find their own strength. As Isabella left the podium to thunderous applause, she carried with her the knowledge that her willingness to endure humiliation and speak truth to power had created lasting change that would protect future generations of military personnel. The red mark on her cheek had faded, but the mark she had made on her institution would endure. The audience filed out of the auditorium, each carrying the responsibility to implement these lessons in their own commands. The story that had begun with an act of abuse had become a testament to the Kofa power of moral courage and institutional accountability, because real change doesn't happen in a single moment. It happens when brave individuals choose to stand up for what's right, and when institutions have the wisdom to listen, learn, and transform themselves in response. If this story inspired you to reflect on your own role in creating cultures of respect and dignity, share it with others who might benefit from its message, because everyone has the power to make a difference when they choose courage over convenience, justice over comfort, and truth over silence. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.